Hi, folks, and welcome to White Collar Week. It's the isolation that destroys us. The solution is in community. Today on the podcast, we have Kelly Paxton and Brian Willingham, two private investigators who work in the world of fraud, embezzlement, and other white-collar crimes. Kelly is in Oregon and is known as the pink-collar crime expert who hosts a podcast, Great Women in Fraud. Brian is the founder of the Diligentia group in New York and has been voted the best private investigator in the galaxy. Both Kelly and Brian are certified fraud examiners, private investigators, professional speakers, and social media influencers. So coming up, the investigators, Kelly Paxton and Brian Willingham, on White Collar Week. I hope you will join us. Hello, and welcome to White Collar Week, a podcast sponsored by Progressive Prison Ministries, the world's first ministry serving the white-collar justice community. I'm Jeff Grant, co-founder and your host. I served almost 14 months in a federal prison for a white-collar crime I committed when I was a lawyer, so I know that it's the isolation that kills us, and the solution is in community. So let's get started. Hi, folks, and welcome to White Collar Week. We have a very special show today. This is called The Investigators. That's the name of today's episode. And we have Kelly Paxton and Brian Willingham. And they are private investigators. A little underappreciated corner of the white-collar justice world, but integral to what lawyers do and what people who want to find out important information about the people that they do business with turn to them, among other things that we're going to find out about. So let me give you a little bit of background. Kelly came to my attention because she has a podcast and she's known as the pink collar crime expert. Pink collar is an even smaller subset of the white collar world, but there are a lot of female white collar criminals out there and white collar prosecutions. She's also called the workplace dishonesty expert. And unfortunately, I know a lot of people who have been dishonest in the workplace. So we'll talk about that too. And Brian Willingham, how do you pronounce it? Diligentia?
That's about as close as I've heard anybody. Diligentia, yep.
Diligentia. I wasn't sure if it was Sha or Tia, but Diligentia. And he lives pretty close to me, actually. He lives in Westchester County, just outside New York City, and I'm not far from there in Litchfield County. And Brian is known as, this is unbelievable. I love this. He was voted the best private investigator in the galaxy. So
True story.
So that's fantastic. We're going to hear about that. And they're both certified fraud experts, private investigators. Professional speakers. If you follow LinkedIn in this sector at all, they're on LinkedIn every single day. And which is where I get most of my information about the private investigation side of things. So why don't we start off by having you each introduce yourselves, and then we'll just get into some conversation about it. Why don't we start with, first of all, Kelly and Brian, welcome to White Collar Week.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Kelly, why don't you start by introducing yourself, and then we'll go to Brian.
Sure. So the long story short is I started with a very typical career in finance. And I worked at the Chicago Board of Trade, became a stockbroker, came back to Oregon. And we had a client who I'm going to say was hinky. And I knew something was not right with him. But this was back before KYC, Know Your Customer. One day we got a phone call from a special agent from U.S. Customs saying, do you know Alan? And this is all public record, so I'm not, divulging state secrets. And I kind of giggled. I was young at that time. I was in my 20s, and I kind of giggled and I said, oh, is that what you're calling him today? Because we had other names for him that he would go by. And fast forward a year later, I called her up and I said, I want to do what you do. And a year past that, I became a special agent for U.S. Customs. And because they liked my financial background. My career is kind of about money. And the first career is how to invest it, how to save it, and how to invest it. The second career is why do people steal it and what they do with it. And the third sort of career where I'm at now is a certified fraud examiner and private investigator and the pink collar crime lady is, why do honest people steal? And so I went from arresting bad guys at U.S. Custom, money launderers, drug dealers, child pedophiles, to working in a local sheriff's office and realizing that in embezzlement cases, money being stolen from a business, it wasn't Bernie Madoff. It was that nice woman who dropped her kids off in the minivan at school in the morning. And that's where kind of crime changed for me. We have this perception that it's bad guys and you cross the street and they're lurking in corners, when really you're more likely to be affected by, as we call it, sweet crime, SUITE, versus street crime. You're much more likely to be a victim of sweet crime. And so now in kind of my third act is I specialize in embezzlement, but I also work with victims to help them understand how honest people steal and how to prevent and detect and investigate embezzlement. Long story short, but it's kind of long.
Thanks, Kelly. That was actually perfect. It worked out great. Brian, maybe you could introduce yourself, and then we'll get into some of the guts of this.
Sure. So first, I think I need to describe a story about why I've been voted the best private investigator in the galaxy. And this, you'll appreciate this, Jeff. In Danbury, Connecticut, there's a pizza place called Stanziato's, which was started by a guy who who got trained at the Culinary Institute of America, was this, trained chef, and opened up a pizza place. And it's this amazing pizza. And they used to have a sign outside that said best pizza in the galaxy or something silly like that. So I just sort of stole their moniker and started using it all over the place. And people started addressing me that way. So that was pretty funny. So I don't take myself too seriously, if you haven't figured that out. But my story is a bit longer than Kelly's. I had never any intention of becoming a private investigator, in part because my father was a private investigator. And it wasn't a field that was really all that particularly interesting to me, despite the fact that when I was in middle school, I took an aptitude test that said that I should either be an air traffic controller or a private investigator. I never wound up pursuing either of those for many years because I was infatuated with sports. I wanted to first be a player on the New York Mets. And once I realized that I wasn't good enough to play on the New York Mets, I wanted to become the general manager or the president of the New York Mets. So I worked in the sports industry for several years, actually, for a sports photography firm. I worked for Major League Baseball. I worked for the New York Giants, did an internship there, and I got my degree from the University of Massachusetts in sport management, which is a very business-focused degree, sure, but has sports involved with it, business, sports law, sports marketing. It's become a sort of very specialized practice. So when I graduated, that's what I thought I wanted to do. Until sort of getting into the field and kind of feeling things out, I realized that there was thousands of people like me who wanted to be in this business, who would work for almost nothing and never left the industry. So when I was working with the New York Giants, everybody that was ahead of me had been there for many years. And in fact, the guy that I reported to is still there after 20 something years and is a fantastic person and should very well be there. But it was tough for me, for somebody I was very passionate about working really hard and working my way towards the top. And it was just an industry which I didn't feel like that skill set was all that useful, frankly. Frankly, I probably should have stuck with it. But the long and short is I ended up working with my father's investigative firm. He's been a licensed investigator since the 1980s. I started working with his firm 20 years ago, actually, this month, actually. And when I started with him, it was really meant to be a temporary thing. I wanted to, make a little bit of money. I was still young. I was thinking about getting my MBA. And ultimately, 9/11 happened. 6 months later, 9/11 happened. And like everybody, he was tremendously affected. He had a client that, owed him $1 million. And it wound up being very hard to lay people off. And it was very difficult business time. So I couldn't leave him at the time. I wound up staying. And, over time, I've just developed this extraordinary passion for the work, the job. And 20 years later, here I am. So it's about 12 years ago, I started my own firm. And I've been working on my own ever since then. And one other quick thing as an entree into white collar crime, my interest in this field has been multiple fold. One is when I was growing up in the business, we were coming of an age where fund-to-fund investing was was hugely popular in the 2000s, early 2000s. Hedge funds were popping up left and right, and there were these companies that would invest in multiple hedge funds.
Sure.
And as part of that, they would do due diligence. They want to make sure that whoever they were investing in was legitimate. So we were doing work for some of the real big hedge funds and fund-to-funds. So I became very enmeshed in that world. And there were a couple really big blow-ups at the time, and some that I actually worked on, including the Bayou Capital, which is Sam Israel, which is in Westchester County. He lived in Armonk. It was a very infamous story. He wound up faking his own death. It was just this fascinating story that I got really intrigued with. Sure. So we were kind of in that little world. And I've done some work on a couple other sort of Ponzi schemers and white-collar criminals. And I've also worked on some of the defense side for some of this stuff too. So that's sort of been my history going back in time there.
So I've got a little thing to add to you, Brian.
Sure.
Is SPACs. Mm-hmm. You're going to be doing SPAC work. SPAC work's just going to be coming out of the walls. So the special purpose acquiring companies, they just took a 20% hit. So get ready for SPACs.
It's hysterical you mentioned that, because I was doing SPAC work 15 years ago. So these were not a thing back then. And we were doing SPAC work years ago. And now it's sort of become a much bigger deal. But yeah, you're totally right. There's going to be all kinds of fallout from that.
You don't think there's a problem inherent in giving people money for blank checks to spend it any way they want without any accountability? You don't think there's a problem with that?
I see no problem whatsoever.
No, probably not. So Brian, the irony probably isn't lost on you that you wanted to work for the Mets, and then Steve Cohen goes and buys the Mets. And of course, he's not a white collar criminal, but
no,
he was certainly embroiled in that for a lot of years. And there's a bunch of his people who went down. So,
so there's obviously been, a lot of things out there in the public about that, insider trading sort of allegations and things along those lines. But, and the Mets themselves had a problem too. They hired a general manager who had a bit of a history, and some news came out that they were not obviously very happy about, and they had to fire the guy because of some unreported thing. So in that particular case, I actually don't think it was all that much their fault, as much as I'd like to blame things on Mets doing horrible things. And I think the Mets have been cursed for many, many years. But this one, I don't know if it was their fault.
So I think there's a lot of ways to cut up this subject, because it's the same for what I do. There's like the before, the during, and the after, which is a way to cut it up. The other ways to cut it up, I think, are the way that Kelly started off with, was that you really can't tell who is committing a white collar crime, and it could be the lady down the street. It could be someone who you least expect, and yet we're drawn to the big names, the sensationalized journalistic names. And then what we tend to do is paint everyone with that broad brush. So why don't we start there? Because, Kelly, what I've contended for a lot of time is that you really can't judge a group of people at all. Everyone's an individual and they all have their own motivations. There are some things in common. So what do you find out there in terms of the people down the street, or the people who are good people who've done something wrong, or maybe you wouldn't think were likely to commit a white collar crime, but then of course you're in the midst of finding out that they have?
The whole hashtag honest people steal, especially now with COVID, and people are sick of hearing about COVID, but we have financial pressures, which is the fraud triangle. You have opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. And we've always said that it's easiest to control for opportunity. Now, rationalization, if you have a bad boss, it's easier to steal from a bad boss than a nice boss. But now we have COVID, and you have industries that have been hit by COVID that you would never expect to be hit by COVID. For example, and no offense to orthopedic surgeons out there, in Oregon, elective surgeries were canceled for a couple of months. And can you imagine being a surgeon who's making $1 million a year, who's got, I'm going to say a big nut to cover, and all of a sudden, maybe they have alimony or kids in private school, and they can't do surgeries. And so what do? Maybe they go out and do a PPP loan, and they, fudge the numbers, or they do the numbers as if they were going to continue to have that, income. So I hate to say money is the root of all evil, because I don't believe that. I think that, rich people can do really, really good things. Poor people can do really good things. But people see money as the Band-Aid. It's the instant Band-Aid. And that's the short-term thinking. Long-term thinking is, maybe you need to learn to live within your budget, or, but people instantly go to money to solve a problem.
When I'm asked by students, what's the greatest lesson I've learned from all of this? Usually my answer is, I've learned to live within my means. So, and it's so interesting that you kind of led off with that, because it feels like this upward mobility pressure is there, and then it's spend. You have to have the bigger house. And all of a sudden the nut grows so large that it has to be maintained. And I've been involved in enough healthcare fraud cases. For example, when I was a lawyer, I represented surgeons, and just the opportunity to code things differently and bundle things differently. It's right there in front of everybody. What's your experience in people being just kind of pushed over that line? Is it that they understand the ethics of it, but that once they go over the line, it's much easier to do again and again and again?
Well, so I've done this work with a forensic psychologist, and Brian, jump in on this.
Yeah, please.
When I get an interview with a suspect, I am always going to ask them, tell me about the first time, because they remember the first time. It is just burned in their brain. Now, we're going to exclude serial grifters and narcissists and psychopaths, but the average, Joe Blow, Sally, whatever, you ask them about that first time. So, Brian, what's the name of the first girl you kissed?
I have no idea. I'm not revealing it in this podcast here.
It's okay. But in your mind, you probably could remember the name of the first girl you kissed. But the 10th girl, it's like that was stealing money. You remember the first time, but then it all becomes a blur. Have you experienced that? Not kissing girls.
For sure. Yeah. Listen, I think, one of the things that from my own personal experience, is that I think this is something that you guys are talking about, is that this sort of constant life pressures to sort of feed the beast. And the reality is that there's never enough money. I make a very good living. I have a very good life, and I have a very good sense of morals and ethics and those kind of things as well. I wouldn't even consider fudging my numbers to collect some PPP money. But I think that's a regular thought process that most people probably have. Nobody's going to catch me. Why couldn't I do it? I have very good close friends who live in, we live in Westchester County, which is probably one of the top few richest counties in all of America, aside from where in the Greenwich area, but Fairfield County. And I have people that are extraordinarily close to me that do sort of shady things all the time, whether it's accidentally forget to return a $10,000-$20,000 check that somebody sent them, or there might be fudging how many employees that they work with. I think there's this constant sort of pressure. And I think, because money is such a taboo topic, I think most people don't really talk about it. They don't know that, so-and-so who's driving around in Mercedes is really up to his eyeballs in debt. And all they see is this, this, how successful people are. But what they don't see is behind the scenes. They don't see that these people are really struggling and probably living way above their means. And I think people make excuses for it, and they start doing things that they wouldn't necessarily do. And I'm very much a believer in, there's no shortcuts to any of this stuff. There's no shortcuts to life. There's no shortcuts to business. There's no shortcuts to any. I mean, once in a while, you might hit the lottery and marry the right person, or actually physically hit the lottery, or something may come into your life that may change everything. But it's rare. And I think there's this sort of Disney version that people want to live or think that might happen, but it's not really the reality of how it happens. So I think that's how a lot of it happens. And I think, we've talked about this before with both of you. I think there's so much white collar crime in our day-to-day lives everywhere, from the local towns to the, local booster club, to everywhere. And I think it's everywhere. And, one of the things that fascinates me about it is that, you can almost understand people who commit crimes that come from absolutely nothing. It's almost understandable. When people commit white collar crime, it's much harder for me to understand. And I'm not a forensic psychologist or somebody who has studied this for that many years. It's less understandable to me. And for me, if I could catch every one of these people and stick them in jail, I would be thrilled about it.
Let's go back to the triangle, because I feel like if we go here into some of the science, our conversation can kind of go out into stories. But I love that triangle of opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. 2 or 3 days ago, there was an article in the Australian Financial Review by a professor in Australia named Clifton Leaf. And he wrote about that. And actually, I think that tomorrow there's a big conference down there in Australia. But what he wrote about was that how white collar criminals sleep easy at night. That was the title. And I wrote to him and I said, I know a lot of white collar criminals, and I don't know any that sleep easy at night. In fact, they've entered a world where they're terrified. They spend their whole lives looking over their shoulders, and the last thing that they can do is sleep easy at night. And in fact, many, including me, by the way, manufacture their own demise. They self-sabotage because they just need it to end, and they don't have the tools to elegantly just move to the next stage, or to be able to say, I messed up and I need to pay those consequences and then move forward in my life. So what do you think about all that?
Well, they might sleep well at night because they take Ambien and they have, 1,000 spreadsheets. So, in my circumstances, or, in my work experience, I haven't dealt with the Bernie Madoffs, but, I've dealt with some fraudsters that have committed some, pretty hefty embezzlements and Ponzi schemes and things like that. I think most of them, again, except for the narcissists, because they're a whole different brand, they know they're going to get caught. And it makes them physically sick. So I know your background, you have, you went through addiction, and addiction probably at the time helped you sleep at night. But when you've seen this, and Brian, tell me if you've seen this, is when you get someone and you interview them, you see the physical relief in their body, their shoulders dropping, the head dropping. They're like, can you imagine working for a company or a boss, and every time the boss is like, hey, can you come in my office for a second, and you're stealing from that boss, what happens to your body physically? And so when the gig is up, and in my case, my practice is I've had more women embezzlers than men. I say women embezzle better than men, but men steal more. is that they all think they're going to get caught eventually. And just I don't think they sleep very well at night. I think a lot of them have drug and alcohol issues. And, it's just easier to have 3 glasses of wine instead of 1 glass of wine to get to sleep. So I don't know. What do you think about that, Brian? Have you seen the physical?
It's really interesting. See, I don't get involved too much in sort of the in-between. I'm usually a before or after. I'm usually either on the defense team, or I'm the guy who's like, hey, can you dig into these guys and let me know if you think that there might be something here. So I don't see that sort of middle part where you're trying to basically, capture them, punish them, or figure out what is going on. Physically and psychologically, I can't sleep at night, and I live about as ethical a life as I possibly can. So I don't know, obviously there's this whole psychological part that I have zero expertise in, that I'm not even going to speak to, but I can't imagine how these people would sleep at night. Listen, I think for the most part, from my own experience, I don't think most people don't go into something saying, I'm going to be a white collar criminal. I think they usually get themselves involved in something, in some sort of mess, some sort of trouble. They needed something for some short period of time, and they're trying to cover up a mistake. And they usually say, well, that wasn't that hard, and I'm just going to do it again and again and again. And I think that's generally what happens. So, there's certainly a time period where they might sleep okay at night, but obviously as time goes on, that can't be easy.
Why don't we talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts? I mean, what is it to actually be a private investigator or do financial investigations, and what are the skills that you actually have to go through? Let's say there's someone's presenting you with a private equity firm or hedge fund wants to look into someone because they want to make an investment, or typically they want to invest other people's money.
Yep.
So everyone in the chain is somehow a fiduciary for someone else. I mean, there's the Bernie Madoff scenario,
sure,
where there were funds investing in funds who were investing in funds. So now you're hired and you're looking at principals who have a product or some kind of financial product or a company. What are the nuts and bolts of what you do in order to ferret out whether or not they're doing the right thing or not?
Sure. So, there's a couple of things. One is, we get contacted by either individual investors who are making some sort of investment in something or something, somebody or someone, whether it's a company or an individual. It could be a private equity firm, it could be a venture capital firm. It could just be, a family office that is investing on behalf of somebody. And when you're wealthy, you get introduced to a lot of people, and somebody's always got a brilliant idea of something to invest in. And there's a lot of people out there that are obviously trying to take advantage of these people. I don't think there's one way or another that you can, and sometimes it's, not necessarily take advantage of them. They want their money, but they might think they have some brilliant idea, but it's terrible. So, they'll come to us and they'll say, hey, we want to do some sort of background investigation on this person. Make sure this person is who they say they are, whether or not they had some serious thing in their past that we need to worry about, or whether or not there's some red flags that we should be concerned about. So on the very, basic level, I want to make sure that Kelly Paxton is Kelly Paxton, that she's a real person, that she really lives in Oregon, that, she has this background, she really is a CFE, she has whatever the case may be. So on a very basic level, sort of confirming the identity of somebody. The second sort of level would be, making sure they don't have a history. Whether that be some serious criminal history, and fraud, embezzlement, or multiple DWIs, or whatever the case may be, any sort of significant criminal history where they serve jail time, the proverbial axe murderer is what you're always looking for. I still have not found an axe murderer, but I'm still looking. And then, the other things, the sort of the second step from there is sort of all the other stuff. And when I say all the other stuff, we're looking at public records, we're looking at open source intelligence like social media, how they're living. So the public records would be, we're checking civil lawsuits to determine whether or not they've been in part of any personal injury claims, whether they've been involved in a number of lawsuits, whether they've been defended in many lawsuits, whether investors are coming after them. We're also looking at things like bankruptcies and judgments and liens to determine, how are they living? Are they really in desperation of money? Have they filed bankruptcy multiple times in their past, which would suggest that they're not very good with money? Are people coming after them for money? Do they owe the federal government millions of dollars, and so on and so forth? We're also trying to determine, from they are who they say they are, whether or not, they really did go to Harvard. They really did serve in the military, and whether or not they really did work for Goldman Sachs. So we're checking sort of regulatory things that we can check, as well as trying to, make sure that from a CV perspective, whether or not they are who they say they are. So a lot of, in my world, but in the investment world, a lot of people like to make these bold claims about, they worked for Steve Cohen, or they worked at Goldman Sachs, or they went to Harvard. And sometimes they're just simply not true. And then obviously, as time has gone on, one of the biggest things has become social media. How do they portray themselves out there on social media? So one of the fascinating things about social media is that anybody can put anything on social media, and it's generally unverifiable. So some guy might walk up to a Bentley and take a picture with a Bentley and take a picture with a whatever car, or so have some fake background that they're, traveling all over the world or whatever the case may be. So social media has become a way for people to sort of portray somebody that they may not necessarily be. So, when you combine all of these factors, we can put together a pretty good picture of who somebody is, based on a lot of public records, open sources. And, one of the really great benefits of what we do is that nobody ever knows that we're ever doing it. We're not calling people. We're not, surveilling them. There's so much information just readily available on the internet that nobody will ever know. And in fact, just recently, I got a call from a client on the West Coast. They were about to meet somebody, a young kid who was in his early 20s, who wanted to who was about to pay cash for a $10 million house. And the kid came under sort of these mysterious circumstances. He was sort of keeping everything quiet, had a letter from a bank that said that he had $50 million in the bank. And the client gave me about 2 hours to dig up whatever I could. And very quickly, we were, just from on its face, I called the client back within 2 hours, and they said there's one of two things. One is this is a complete fraud. Or number two, you have to seriously question wherever this money, if it is real, where it's coming from. And, I wouldn't be counting on the deal happening. The kid had a very extensive background, including things all over social media. So, there's so much information available about people that can give you a pretty good sense or an idea about character issues and things that would be a warning flag to anybody who's investing money, whether it be issues of, whether they are living beyond their means, whether, there's certain character issues that come up in, criminal cases or civil litigation, or whether, there's other red flags that, to be determined, sort of thing. So there's so much stuff that we can identify and that we can provide to a client in these cases.
Kelly, what do you think about that?
Well, so this is like small world. When I became a custom special agent, they have to interview, where you've lived and things like that. Well, it turns out I had worked for my dad. And because I had worked for my dad, they had to interview him. Normally, they don't interview a family member. So at this point, my dad had been very successful, and then he had lost everything. And he gets a knock on the door at 8 a.m. He opens the door, probably in a bad bathrobe. And there's an ex-FBI agent who, it turns out that my dad used to play liar's poker with at the local bar when my dad was a commodities trader. And my dad calls me up, this was before cell phones, calls me up and he's like, guess who just came and talked to me about your background? And I'm like, I don't know. And he's like, oh, it's that FBI agent I used to win Liar's Poker every Friday. And I'm like, I'm done, Dad. I'm done. But the point being is, my dad said I like to say it was curious, but he was like, she's just Snoopy. And that's what we are. We are Snoopy. When something doesn't make sense, like there was just a Ponzi scheme in your neck of the woods. It was like $1.8 billion. There's a guy in front of, I think it was his Lambo, Lamborghini for the ones who don't know, but his Lambo. There's pictures of him going to Disneyland, and I have a thing about Disneyland. And so I have a new stockbroker because my stockbroker retired. So he has a team, and now I have a new stockbroker. I immediately send the article with the picture of the guy with the Lambo, and I send it to her, and I'm like, just want to check to see what kind of car you drive. And she writes back and she goes, we have like a Ford F-150 because we have 2 Great Danes and the crates will only fit in that. And I was like, okay. So it's like, that's kind of funny. Like, I didn't expect her to say she drives the Lamborghini, but like the previous broker that I had, he always drove trucks because he was like kind of a hobby farmer. Mm-hmm. So I personally, I don't want my stockbroker driving a $350,000 car. I just don't, because their nut is huge. So it's just kind of like that. It's putting a puzzle together. And sometimes the puzzle is a square puzzle. Sometimes it's a rectangular puzzle. And now, you've got crazy round puzzles. But we have to put those pieces together and make sure we have all the pieces as best we can.
Mm. Well, I know from experience, but it feels to me like you're often either are or should be part of a team. So there are lawyers involved, maybe there are forensic accountants involved, and there's some science to this, there's some art. I mean, for example, I have friends who are forensic accountants, and if they have a complete set of source data to operate from, then they have programs in which they can find trends. They can isolate ways in which money is moved from account to account, and it's not like people might picture in their mind sitting there with crates of boxes going through them one at a time, like in a movie. They can use algorithms to pretty quickly get to the patterns that they need in order to do a deeper dive. So you're looking at social media. What kind of tools do you use, and how deep can you get using technology?
So we can get pretty deep. I mean, one of the sort of sneaky little things that I like to talk about is that usually people who are committing some sort of fraud, or who are on the edge of committing some sort of fraud, or who are just very careful about what they do, you either have one or two people. You're either out there posing with your Lambo and your fancy houses and your fancy cars, or you're generally very cautious about these kind of things. And you're normally not in the middle. So one of the sneaky things that we do is that we like to look at all the people around them to really figure out what their story is. So that you can, even without somebody posting everything on social media, you can really get a pretty good sense about people through that way. So listen, there's tons of software available to us that helps sort of weave a story and put together some of the stories. Not everybody is on social media. Everybody has a different sort of take on it. I try to protect my social media as much as possible. I'm doing my own sort of due diligence on myself. I'm about to teach a course next week, and I'm doing a due diligence on myself. And I'm surprised how much information is out there on me. And some of the techniques that I'm teaching other people, if you really wanted to find out a lot about me, you could. And some of the ways is through sort of digging through your family members and those kind of things. Mm-hmm. So there's still plenty of information, and from social media is only one of the sources that we obviously use, but public records is a huge part of it. And no matter what you do, your public record trail from the point that you're born to the time that you die is pretty extensive. The documents and things that you were talking about before, like the internal financial documents and those kind of things, those aren't readily available to me. I'm not breaking into anybody's safe or into somebody's house or cracking into their computer and identifying that. Bernie Madoff was able to pull off a Ponzi scheme for 20 plus years by keeping that stuff pretty tight to the vest. And the people that control that information, very well paid and obviously quiet. We're obviously, there are certain pieces of the puzzle you can put together. You can't always put the whole case together, but there's always something that you can put together. And I'll give you an example. Recently, we were doing some work on behalf of a law firm in the Midwest. They had invested with somebody who was out on the West Coast, and it sort of absconded. Well, absconded is not the right word because it's not even a litigation, but there's some millions of dollars that's sort of missing at this point. And what we did some background on the person, and what we were trying to do is trying to identify if anything in his history that would suggest that he's trying to pull the wool over these investors' eyes and, trying to pull a scam here. And there really wasn't. And we couldn't really find anything that suggested the person was a little bit of an embellisher, which certainly raises some red flags. I heard a really funny quote today that the truth is not always the best story. So people like to sort of make things up. He had a little bit of embellishing in his background. But one of the things we found is we were doing, as part of our research, they were about to sue this person for several $1 million. And they wanted to get a sense of whether or not he had several $1 million. And when we were doing our research, we found that this person was living in this house, and the house was owned by a trust, and the trust happened to be ABCD Trust. It wasn't ABCD because I can't even remember what it was. But I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And getting behind a trust is pretty challenging because there's not really, the lawyers will know about it. But, we looked at who signed on behalf of the trust, but we really couldn't pin anything down.
Sure. And
as we were doing our research, we were able to sort of start connecting dots and realize that ABCD, whatever the acronym was actually the name of the guy, his dog, his daughter, and his wife. And we were able to determine that the attorney was somebody that he had done work, he had signed some corporate documents with. So now we had this $6 million house that he had literally just put on the market in the last couple of weeks that he was about to sell and possibly take all the proceeds from and go to Belize or wherever he was going. So that was a sort of important piece of intelligence for us. So the point of that story is that you're not always looking in one place to say, all right, this guy is there's something wrong because of this. It's usually the entire story that once you put it together, kind of gives a overall overview of everything.
So Kelly, Brian, do you put together reports, and is there a scaling system, for example? So do people get anywhere from an A to an F or 100 to a 0? And what about like source documents themselves?
Yeah.
So and here's kind of where I want the answer to that, if you could give it to me. But also, it seems to me that different clients are going to have like different things that will touch them off. I mean, an example is I know a guy who went to prison for a couple of years, and he's out now and he's doing whatever he's doing. And he loves to take pictures of himself on social media showing like $40,000 watches that he's wearing. Now, it's just me formerly having a life where I had a couple of nice watches, but I wouldn't do business with anyone who's showing a $40,000 watch on social media. It's as simple as that. I don't need to know more than that. But that's just me. So do people, when you work with people, you kind of get to know what their touch points are, and what does your report look like, and source documents?
So we do create a report and we draft a report. We don't have a scoring system. It's something that I've thought about for many, many years, but it's not something we've ever done. Source documents is always something that I will provide. All of this stuff is, most of the stuff is public record or open source, or, I can print it out from the web, or I've got it from a court document or Secretary of State or wherever, and I will include these source documents. But you are 100% accurate in your sort of what you just said about, you would never work with somebody who had a $40,000 watch. I have all kinds of reasons why I don't work with people. I generally only work with people that I really like. And what my position on certain person may be totally different from yours. So the general way that we approach it is that we don't really make decisions on behalf of people. We don't create a scoring system. We present you with the facts and the evidence and say, hey, we happen to notice that there's 82 pictures with him with, Rolexes and various watches, but you can make your own judgment from that as to whether or not, I'm not telling you what they're worth, how much, or what that even means, but you may decide that that's something that you wouldn't do. I've had people who have lied about their degrees, who have filled out a form that said, I've never been arrested for anything, and had multiple DWIs. We had a guy that we did work on a couple of years ago that had something like 6 or 7 DWIs over an 8 or 9 year period. And to me, that was a clear sign of alcoholism and trouble. There was nothing else in his background that was really scary. But I guess, if you're hiring that person to drive your kid to school, that probably would be a big problem. But whether or not the guy is a genius and can invest in something, like, listen, my level of what I would invest with him or not is probably much higher. Like, I worked too hard for my money to give it to somebody who's going to drink it away. But who's to say it is for somebody else? We've had, there's tons of stories that I can, of course, none of them are popping to my head where, it's just cases where I'm not the judge and jury. I am a fact finder. I present the information, and whether or not, you want to make a decision based on that's up to you. And the perfect example is, Bernie Madoff is somebody that we all know and love to a certain extent from in the white collar world. But, there weren't a whole lot of huge red flags with Bernie Madoff. There was Harry Markopolos, is somebody who was a guy who was up in Boston who was screaming to the SEC for years upon years upon years that there's something wrong here. There's something wrong here. I don't know what it is, but there's something wrong here. There's no way that this could happen. And if you really go back and look at it, there was a couple sort of red flaggish things. He used an accountant who was in a strip mall in Rockland County, a 2-person accounting firm who was running like a $60 billion fund, which is a major red flag. But I'm not going to tell you, Kelly, you cannot invest with this guy because he's got a 2-person accounting firm. That's a red flag to me, and I'll point out that information to you. But whether or not you choose to pursue it, that's your own business.
Well, and Jeff, one thing that you've probably seen this, Brian, is sometimes people come to us and they just want us to validate what they sense or feel. So whether, all of a sudden we find the smoking gun that, yes, they were sued before, or they have an extra family that, isn't aware of, sometimes they just want to come, and I don't want to say they're going to do one of two things. They're going to kind of agree and go, oh, thank God you found that. Or, oh yeah, I already knew about that. I'm going to invest with them anyway. So while we provide, I think, a lot of value and it's objective, and as certified fraud examiners, we actually have a code of ethics that we don't declare guilt. Like, if I were to go and say that someone stole, no, I don't do that. I say the money was here and it went to the suspect's bank account. It's up to you to decide if it was stolen. Like, I keep my personal opinion to myself, and it's part of our, code of ethics. But a lot of times people want us to kind of, I'm going to say validate their opinion. Look at Theranos. Theranos and Madoff are really good examples. The exclusivity. There was, there's a clip, because I do a course on fraud and pop culture, of Bernie Madoff, and he's just goading this guy to up the money that he has to invest to be part of this super secret club. And then, Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, I'm going to say, no offense to the audience out there, she went after old white guys who thought she was cute and didn't do due diligence. And it's like, oh, did you get in on that deal? There's this, when you get to that strata of society where it's a little bit of clown money, as I call it, it's kind of being part of the club to say, oh yeah, I'm in with Madoff, or oh, I got in with Theranos. And I mean, we could show them all day long, but sometimes they're just going to do what they're going to do.
Yeah, and I thought of one of those stories now that Kelly was mentioning it. One of the stories that is from Nicholas Cosmo. I forgot the name of the fund that he was part of, but it was in Long Island. It was around the same time as Bernie Madoff. And a family member, actually, who lived on Long Island, and a number of sort of working class people had invested with Nicholas Cosmo. And I think he had raised something like $400-something million. At some point, he was guaranteeing 15% returns as sort of the normal Ponzi scheme, pyramid scheme thing. He's guaranteeing 15% returns. Checks were coming in regularly. But sort of questions were sort of out there as like how he's making all this money and how is it guaranteed and all this stuff. But people don't generally ask all that much questions when they're, sort of getting their checks. So a family member said he was concerned enough that he asked me to look into it. So I looked into it, and it turns out that Nicholas Cosmo had served jail time in the late 90s for stealing money like from a client. And there were a number of other red flags, including, he had sort of pumped up, he had paid to have his company like rated in Inc. magazine and was sort of pumping up who he was about this. But the guy had served jail time for stealing from clients. And I'm thinking like, oh my God, here's the home run. Like, here's a perfect reason to take your money out and never look back. And he didn't. He kept it in. He's like, oh, I'm just going to leave it in. I didn't think, he's admitted to it. We confronted him on it. He's now admitted to it. And, he said it was all a mistake. And I said, okay. And within a year, it was a $450 million Ponzi scheme that had been, a lot of working class people had lost a lot of money. So to your point before about, the level at which some people are willing to sort of keep their money with somebody or to turn a blind eye or whatever the case is, the psychological part of it, I don't necessarily understand fully, but it's fascinating nonetheless.
So, Kelly, you've made your name in pink collar crime. So this, of course, isn't the full range of your experience, obviously, but this is something now that people know you as the pink collar crime lady, I guess they call you. So what is it about women that is so intriguing, women who commit crimes that's so intriguing? I know there was a pink collar TV show for a while.
Don't waste 8 hours of your life. Marcia Clark got it wrong. That's why she lost the OJ case. She doesn't do her research.
But it feels like there are legitimate corners of all of this, and then what there is kind of the sensationalism why don't we first go into what you find fascinating and why you've decided to have a specialty in pink collar crime, and then I'll ask a follow-up question.
So I think pink collar crime found me. I was sitting at the sheriff's office one day and I realized all my suspects but one were women. And then the other part was like, we've said it and Brian said it and I've said it, bad guys, bad guys, bad guys. We don't say bad chicks or, bad ladies. So it's kind of, I'm going to say mind-blowing in a bad way when you see that nice woman, like I said, dropping her kids off at the minivan and she's like ripping off the soccer club. We have this cognitive dissonance, like, but her kids are so nice and her husband is really nice and they always bring cookies and yet you're like, but she's stealing. And so for me, I had dealt with, like I said, money launderers, drug dealers, pedophiles, and, it's easy to say they're icky, like, ooh, they should go to prison. But what do you say about that woman who has done a really good job raising her children and maybe her spouse has left or she has a sick kid or a kid gets thrown, in jail or something like that? Does it make them bad? Like when you're little or when you have children and you take them to the grocery store And you say, if you get separated from mommy, go look for the nice lady. And if you see a mean bad guy, scream, yell, and run. Like, but again, dentists, 3 out of 5 dentists get ripped off. They get ripped off by that nice lady. So that my mind just went to like, wow, it can happen to anyone. And knock on wood, I haven't had to make that type of decision. And I hope I would never have to. I have a colleague who's a CFE, CPA, CFF, and he doesn't like to watch or listen or take any training from someone who is, a felon who's committed this. And I'm like, dude, you're missing understanding how and why. And, and he's like, I would never cross the line. And I'm like, you got a kid, don't you? I don't know if you ever saw the movie Leverage, or not movie, it was the miniseries Leverage. Did you watch that, Brian?
Mm-mm.
Oh my gosh, it's so fascinating. So it's this guy, and it was filmed in Portland. So that's kind of why I like it. Timothy Hutton. He was.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, high-end insurance investigator. And it turns out his kid gets sick, has some type of cancer. Mm-hmm. And the insurance company that he has literally recovered millions for, he goes to ask, to pay for this experimental treatment. And they say no. So he kind of becomes Robin Hood. We all have a price. I don't think anyone doesn't have a price. Mine is not financial. It doesn't have to be a financial price. But I just saw people who, unfortunately, their price was pretty low.
There's an investigator that I've worked with recently, and I think you're totally right. I think everybody's got a price, and I think most people's is financial. Kelly is an exception to that rule. But I think for the joke that he would always say is like, I have a price, but nobody's ever offered me that price. It was so outrageous. It was like, listen, for $100 million, I'd pretty much do anything.
Okay, who is that person, Brian? I bet I know him.
I'm not revealing that today.
Okay.
So earlier you mentioned PPP loans, and I went to prison for SBA loan fraud. So I talk about it all the time. I talk about it in lectures. I talk about it online. And it's one of those topics that comes around every once in a while. There's nothing sexy about the SBA or SBA loans, but after a disaster, there's a lot of government money, and what we're going through now is completely unprecedented. There's never been this level of disaster funding in the history of the world, probably. So the numbers are staggering because there are trillions. Well, there's at least $1 trillion of loan money out there. There are 8 or 9 million loans that are given so far, and given out so far, and the people who are in charge of these loans, the SBA, but also the Congress, the enabling acts and things like that. What they've said in advance is, we know that there will be a large percentage of fraud and fraudulent loan either applications or misuse of the money, but that's a risk that we're willing to take. We understand it because we need to push the money out there. We need to push it out fast. So even if that number is 10%, and which they'll prosecute 10% of that, we're talking about a lot of money. So what's your experience with people who are now, their businesses are in the process of being crushed? Again, what we just talked about was, what's your price? And there are people who are out and out are committing fraud, but then there are 2 people who are either embellishing, or they don't even understand what the concept of fraud really is. They don't have their numbers together, at least with the speed in which, so they're estimating, or they're putting a number out there that they may honestly believe that their revenue was X, but the reality is that it wasn't even close to X. So what's your experience with all of this?
So I love Reddit. Reddit is just a deep, dark hole that I can spend a lot of time in. And right when this initially happened, I went into the Reddit and I put in like PPP fraud. And oh my God, hours later. And then I talked to a colleague, I'm going to say one of my felon friends. And it turns out his wife worked for a company that went to put money into a PPP fraud or to get loan money. And the same thing, he's like, I want you to put the numbers together to show X because we were on this trajectory to X, but then COVID hit. And so luckily the woman said, hey, why don't you talk to my husband? And my husband might give you some ideas here. And sure enough, her husband's like, again, we have optimism bias. We don't ever think we're going to get cancer. We don't ever think we're going to get embezzled. You getting a $150,000 loan, you're like, I'm too little. No, we catch low-hanging fruit. The government catches low-hanging fruit. You get the same statistic for Congress, for funding, for catching Pablo Escobar as you do for a guy selling a dime bag of heroin in Old Town. So who are you going to go after? And these people don't understand that. So there is going to be a lot of fraud and people are I remember the mortgage fraud crisis because I did a lot of work with mortgage fraud and I belong to a networking group and this mortgage broker shows up. He never came afterwards. I swear. I think I scared him away. There was a lot of people who, like in The Big Short, you got strippers buying 5 or 6 houses and, how are they doing it? They think I'll never get caught. I'm too little for the government to be bothered with. Well, I got a lot of little people who got bothered by the government. Mm-hmm. So, and then there's this, it's, I'm too little, or it's, I paid taxes my whole entire life. It's my turn. And there's a whole thing in criminology and psychology about, the neutralization theories. So, yeah, I think the SBA, if you want to be an investigator for the government, I think it's going to be a lot of work.
Boom time.
Yeah, boom time.
Yeah. For somebody who applied for a PPP loan, there was just so much, as you mentioned, there was just, the government wanted to get money out to these businesses as quickly as possible. There was very little oversight, very little regulation, very little double checking of anything. And as I'm going through the process myself, and I'm thinking to myself, this is going to be a disaster. So I think there's obviously a subset of people who are committing outright fraud. I mean, there's plenty of them out there. You can read stories about them every day. And there's a subset of people that, are in sort of that their lives are turned upside down, devastating. I hope I can get this back. I don't know. Maybe I'll fudge it a little bit or, I paid taxes all these years, I deserve this or whatever the case may be. I need to feed my family. And, sometimes it might have worked out and sometimes it didn't. But I think in this particular case, this was just something that was so ripe for fraud and whatever that, underwriting that they did, that they said, maybe 10% or whatever. I don't know if that was a real number, Jeff, that you mentioned, but I'm fairly certain it was infinitely more than that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
The people that really needed it. I mean, listen, there was companies at the beginning that were, this was meant to be for small businesses who didn't have access to public funds, and there were public companies that were, applying for this, and they got caught and sort of trashed in the media, and they wound up giving it back. So, and, Tom Brady's, business applied for a PPP loan, which most people have, no sympathy for whatsoever since he makes tons of millions of dollars. So it was just something that was just so unbelievably ripe for fraud.
The concept of low-hanging fruit, I think it's really important because, as people who are in the sector, we go after the easy ones. or at least systemically, we go after the easy ones. Here's an example that I'd like you to react to, because people tend to think that here's the moment in time and here's the crisis and whatever, and I can justify whatever I need to do. But the reality is that the statutes of limitations are long, and the world shifts. And now, for example, under the current administration, they could have a much more prosecutorial bent. And now it's 2 or 3 years down the line, and there are young assistant U.S. attorneys in their offices who are now ambitious, and their offices have they got a memo, maybe from the way top down, or maybe it's regional, and saying, okay, we're going to go after all of these PPP loans from 3 years ago. And so you could just be kind of sitting at your pizzeria or wherever you are, flipping pizzas. And then, as happened to your dad, Kelly, an FBI agent walks in, or someone from a government agency that you never even heard of. It could be the FDIC, it could be the SEC if there's a public, and it might not even be something that you did. They may have found out that your accountant has fudged hundreds of reports, or that your bank had poor underwriting, and so they're taking samples from the bank. So what was it post-mortgage crisis? What was the time lag? And do you have any sense about how close to the statute of limitations there are? I mean, are their investigations complete, or what are they looking for?
I worked at, this case kind of haunts me still. I worked for I took a gig for a financial institution, and they had found one of their customers had done a mortgage, and it seemed that they had falsified it because that house that was their primary residence, and it was underwritten as a primary residence, quickly was put up as a rental, and they bought a different house. Well, they brought me in, and I went and I interviewed this young family. And do I think the mortgage broker helped them facilitate this? But they had no idea. So I go and I interview the mortgage broker, upside down and sideways. He's not admitting to anything because it's his livelihood. And I go and interview the husband and wife, and they're freaked out. They're in their early 30s. They think, they have no idea. So I come back to the board of directors and the CEO, and I'm like, by law, you can file a SAR, a suspicious activity report.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you that you may ruin this young family's life forever. And they didn't understand. I'm like, because it's low-hanging fruit. And maybe the FBI you get a hungry agent goes, well, this is mortgage fraud. And it was a gray area, and I don't know what they ever did. But it was one of those things where they were somewhat complicit, but not really. And by law, the bank could have filed it, but I think they could have easily justified not filing it. And they didn't. They just kept saying, by law, we have to do it. And I'm like, but do you understand what could happen? And I have a feeling they filed it, and I've never seen the family, the husband, be arrested. So hopefully it went fine. But that's one of those things that I had to bring to the board's attention. Like, you don't know what filing this SAR can or cannot do for a person.
Listen, I think the bottom line with what we were just talking about is that investigations are long and messy, and they take lots of time and effort and resources. And the bottom line is that, if it's unless you run into the wrong private party, the government's not going to be prosecuting a lot of these things because it's just not big enough. Some small local charity that, somebody stole $30,000 or $40,000 from, nobody's coming after that person unless you piss off the wrong person, unless it's somebody, in many cases, some of these small charities or local sports booster clubs or whatever will just sweep it under the rug. Nobody will ever hear about it because they don't want to go through the time and the effort to actually dig it up and figure it out. They'll either get rid of the person, they'll quietly go away, or it'll just go on forever. So I think, when I hear the word low-hanging fruit, it totally makes sense to me in terms of not all these cases are going to be prosecuted. Not everybody's going to be going out. They want to make examples of certain people. And they're going to put, some of these big PPP frauds, what we were just talking about, are going to be in the news of the guys that got the $2 million loan who had 0 employees and they bought Bentleys and cars and those kind of things. They're going to make examples of those people and hopefully, scare the bejesus out of the rest of the people. But whether or not they're really going to prosecute these things, it's really unlikely. And I think there's 2 things from that. I think one is that people, I think, can think they can get away with it for sure, which I believe is 100% true. But also it's something we haven't touched upon, and I've heard this from other white collar criminals. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, Jeff, is that some of them say it was worth it. I've heard 2 people that have told me that these are guys that spent time in jail, who lived a good life for a couple of years and made, spent millions of dollars and whatever the case may be, spent a couple of years in jail. And they said, if I had to do it all over again, I'd do it because the punishment doesn't always fit the crime. And you do have this sort of stain on your life forever. But for some people, they would do it all over again. And I'm curious what you think about that, Jeff.
What a great question. I don't think it's worth it. No matter what, I don't think it's worth it. I think that smart, talented people can make money without having to steal it. And if you have to steal it, then maybe you're not so smart or talented. And I've had to come to terms with that. I think that inherent in that question is 2 things. Is one, if we're balancing risk and return, not everybody's in a position where the return is so great that it might outweigh the risk. Now, I lived in Rye, New York, and Greenwich, Connecticut, and it would probably be difficult to stand in front of the entry class of one of these big finance companies, 500 or 1,000 people in the room. And these people, the people in that room, they have dreams of making hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know what you could do if you just stood in front of them and said, listen, look around the room and 2 or 3% of you are going to be prosecuted in the next 5 years. So just know that you might be one of them, and it might have nothing to do with what you think it's going to have to do with. It might be the guy sitting next to you is doing something, and that leads them to you. You can't outsmart anybody. So that's my first answer. The second answer is that very few people do these things alone. So the conspiracy issues and the whistleblower issues, I'm thinking that it's possible that whistleblowing is going to become a cottage industry. People are out of work. You don't have money, you start blowing the whistle. And I think the government has made it a lucrative undertaking, or they're trying to. So I don't really know where that's going to stand, but I hope that's a complete answer. I'm really glad you asked that question.
Glad I asked it. Listen, it's always been something that's fascinated me for many years, and it's the 2 white collar criminals that I've spoken to directly have both said the same thing. Whether or not they continue to sort of toe that line and what they're doing now. I don't know if you would have your answer would be the same as everybody else's. So
yeah, I agree with that. So we're running out of time here. Why don't we just wrap up with each of you taking a minute or two, and what's the big takeaway here? Because you spend a lot of time in this sector. What's the takeaway that, given that our audience is generally people who've committed crimes, their families, professionals surrounding it, what's the big takeaway? What do you want people to know about investigators and investigating, and so that they can kind of pay attention to what you do and why you do it? And then please give your contact information.
Well, I'll start. So one of the things is I've done prosecution work and I've done defense work, and I will say that I love the defense work. There is nothing worse than taking your liberty away. And I hate to say it, there's bad work in any industry, and that includes law enforcement. And usually it's like overreaching or overcharging. So I love the defense work because it's, and the cheesy term holistic, we get a look at the whole person. We get a look at the circumstances around it. I also think that both the suspects and the victims that I've worked with, and maybe you can say something to this, Jeff, we never want a fraud to happen, but it has changed their life. And I'm going to say sometimes, most of the time for the better. Something really good is going to come out of it. I had a victim, $500,000 loss, needed a loan, went to one of their customers. The customer is a billionaire, and they had to be fully transparent, and he felt for them because he goes, this happened to me a long time ago. Them reaching out to him, they've gotten more business than they ever knew what to do with. So as painful as it was when they went to someone and it turns out that they had this, he fully supported them. So whether you're a suspect or a victim, it's not the end of the world. Like you've made, I'm going to say a much better career by doing what you do. So investigators, I think we're helpers. We're kind of like, we're a little bit of, I'm going to say, financial and open source intelligence social workers. I don't know. What do you think about that, Brian?
Interesting way of putting it. I really, so John Gill, who's a member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, he said something to me when I am a certified fraud examiner. I think Kelly is too.
Yeah.
No, Kelly? So I took a course many years ago, and John was teaching the course, and he said something that has stuck with me forever. And he said that fraud changes. Fraud doesn't go away; it just changes. So we've talked about things that have been going on in terms of white collar fraud for dozens of years, whether it's mortgage fraud, whether it's Ponzi schemes, which were all the rage a couple of years ago and are still the rage, and now it's PPP fraud, mortgage fraud, whatever the case may be. It just continues to evolve. And what is fascinating for me as an investigator and as somebody who's just fascinated by life, it's just figuring out where that next fraud is going to be and how it's going to change and how it's going to sort of manifest itself. Listen, fraud is inevitable. There's no way around it. People are going to take advantage of things. I truly feel for the people who really get caught up in something. I feel horrible for victims of these white collar fraud, because I think one of the things that gets lost is that a lot of people like to say that white collar fraud is a victimless crime. Mm-hmm. People lose their life savings, and people have had horror stories about these things. Yeah. And it's something that I'm extraordinarily passionate about, because I know how people have to lose your life savings in something, and somebody that you thought was real, that you knew, whatever the case may be. I think it's really sad. And, it's one of the advantages as an investigator that I have, is that I have a chance to sort of remove myself from everything. I'm looking at it from a totally clean slate. And most of the time people come to me and they already have this sort of opinions and thoughts and all these perceptions, and they've inputted a lot of their life into this story. But I can look at it from a blank slate, and I can look at it from a very honest opinion. So, I think one thing that I wouldn't lose sight of in this whole thing is the victims. And those are people that I really, have some significant sorrow for.
Yeah, and the victims come in all different shapes and sizes. There's children and spouses and family members and communities that have put their trust in people, and it can all come crumbling down. And this cascading mistrust of people and of the system that is supposed to be, well, you would think that we're put on this planet to help one another. And when that becomes eroded, it can be very difficult. Well, look, thank you both. Why don't you just quickly give your contact information? We'll have it all in the show notes as well.
You can find me at pinkcollarcrime.com or just kellypaxton.com.
Lovely.
And I'm at diligentiagroup.com, DILIGENTIA group.com. And I am on every social media platform that you can possibly think of, except Clubhouse. Haven't gotten there yet.
Oh, I'm on Clubhouse now. Oh, I'm there.
I'm an Android person, so I guess I'm out of the loop.
Thank you both so much. And blessings to you both. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for joining us on White Collar Week, sponsored by Progressive Prison Ministries. You can learn more about us on our website, prisonist.org. That's prisonist, like feminist. And please remember to rate, review, and share this podcast so that families suffering in silence can find us if they need us. See you next time.